Right, so Brian is on vacation or otherwise occupied today. My name is Matthias Eifert. I know a lot of you, but not all of you. So I'm just filling in for today, and really my job consists exclusively of walking through these slides. Many of you know them already, but I'm still going to spend a couple of minutes on them. Welcome to the DC Scrum user group, and we're, as always, very happy to have all of you, have everybody here to get together as members of the Agile community, hear an interesting presentation, talk about it, exchange ideas, get to know each other a little bit better, all that good stuff. If you want to tweet about what's happening tonight, here are the relevant Twitter handles. Let's see, what else? Yes. You're in the ATX, the Arlington Tech Exchange, which is a facility run by Excel Consulting, and as usual, they sponsor both the room and the pizza and the beverages, so yay. Thank you to Excel Consulting. And this is just one of the many meetups that Excel supports. We're very active across the Agile community, the software community, all kinds of different aspects. There's lots of good content here, lots of good stuff. So if you have, if one of these gets you interested, and you haven't been there, go check it out. It's all really, really good stuff. All of them are on Meetup, of course. And yeah. Let's see, we have a couple of interesting events coming up, planned already for February. This one is going to be a talk about a topic that's becoming more and more important in the Agile community: happiness. We don't just want to make work more efficient and produce better quality and all that. One key component of Agile is that it's supposed to make people enjoy their work more, because happy people are more productive and more efficient and all that good stuff. And it's just a nicer way to do work. So we're going to have a great presentation on happiness in an Agile context, February 23rd. And then in March, actually that is in early March, so it's only going to be a couple of weeks later, we have a presentation on exploratory testing, the awkward teenager of testing. There's lots of background information to be found and lots of best practices. Shouldn't use that term as an Agilist. Lots of good practices that you can customize to your specific context around all kinds of testing. Exploratory testing is usually kind of loosey-goosey and left to everybody's own devices. So we're going to have an interesting presentation on how to put some structure around that and what is exploratory testing all about. As I mentioned, this is Excel's training facility here. We have some classes coming up. We have a monthly CSM, Certified Scrum Master. We have a couple of different versions of the CSPO, one in particular geared towards business analysts, so that's kind of an interesting extension of that. One of the classes that Brian always points to as being woefully underutilized, the Certified Scrum Developer. You can't be a good developer in an Agile environment without understanding Agile engineering practices. So if you are a developer, or if you have developers on your team who could learn something about that, that is a great class, because it teaches people about all the interesting and necessary things that we need to make Agile work from a technical perspective. We have a couple of classes coming up that are not part of the normal certification program. One is a user story workshop in late March, 3/29. So if you're struggling with cutting your user stories to the right size, or understanding how to do that incremental iterative approach and get your user stories to something your team can work with, 3/29, a whole day dedicated to that. And then we have a brand new class in April, 11 and 12, and Trent is actually going to teach that. A certified Kanban systems design class that counts. I think it's the Lean Kanban University, right?
Yes.
And you will get a certification out of that. It counts towards the Kanban Management Professional 1 level. So Trent just did the Lean Kanban University Train the Trainer, so he is our resident Kanban expert. This is going to be a really, really cool class. All right. There's also another very interesting class coming up, a LESS course that's relatively rare around here. Doesn't happen too often. We're going to have it right here, 3 days. I think the trainer is Kareem Parbat, coming over from England for this. I've taken the class with him. That was a really, really great 3-day course. So if you're interested in the other scaling model, check it out.
The other scaling.
And of course, the last one, Excel is hiring. We're always looking for good people. Pretty much everything, whether you're a technical person, a UX person, we're looking out for data integration developers, good Scrum Masters, good Agile coaches, all that good stuff. Can everybody from Excel raise their hand real quick? thank you. Those are all the people you can talk to if you have questions about what it's like to work at Excella and what kind of people we're looking for and what's so awesome about this company. And I can actually say that it's a great company to work for. We are a Washington Post best place to work for 3 years in a row now, Washington Business Journal. I think our Glassdoor rating is 4.5 or something like that. So that does speak, that does say something. So yeah, if you're interested, come to talk to any of us. And just to make that point a little bit more. And I believe that's my last slide, so I'm going to hand it over to Trent to tell us about Kanban and distributed cognition. And
cool.
Now the awkward moment where we swap out the HTML tables.
Yep.
It's all yours. Yeah, that wasn't really worthy of applause, but thanks anyway.
Oh, that's not the right one. That's the right one. Excellent. Wonderful. Thank you, Matthias. I appreciate that. And thank you, all of you, for coming and giving me an opportunity to talk about Kanban, which is something I like very much. I'm going to talk about a few other things in an attempt to illustrate why and how I think Kanban is so powerful, particularly in how it gets us to think about our work or conceptualize it. And that gets into this distributed cognition point. So a little bit about me, which might explain or introduce some of the places that we're going to go in this talk. I am a coach with Excella Consulting. A couple years ago, I was a finalist for the Brickell Key Award for Excellence in the Kanban community. Didn't win that, but I have won some awards for my writing as a historian. It's a hobby that I have, but it's a little bit more intense than most hobbies. And I really value how we can weave together different disciplines to bring new perspectives. And I'm hoping to do a little bit of that for you in the talk tonight. So some of this might seem like it meanders a little bit, but trust me, it should all come together in the end. And if it doesn't, please let me know. I also like to call myself a complexity theorist. I really like the way Jürgen Appello weaves together modern complexity science with the idea of agile and agile software approaches. I buy into that as well, and that's going to inform some of what I talk about this evening. So a topic tonight. I think that if you do a Kanban system well, it can become a system or create an environment of distributed cognition. And through some of these anecdotes that I'm going to relate, I'll explain what I mean by that. So we're going to talk about what that is and how we might do it. And to do that, we're going to start 75 years ago. We're going to look at something the United States Navy did in the aftermath of Pearl Harbor and in the early years of World War II, and how they created a system of distributed cognition to help them be more effective and make sense of combat situations. So last December, we marked the 75th anniversary of Pearl Harbor. This is the battleship Nevada, damaged in the attack, the only ship to get underway, the only battleship to get underway during the attack, and was set upon by Japanese dive bombers in the second wave. Pearl Harbor is important in this context for us here because it changed the paradigm somewhat. Both navies had spent a great deal of time preparing for what they saw as a coming conflict. But a lot of the U.S. Navy's preparation had been oriented around a singular battle fleet advancing initially very rapidly and later on step by step across the Pacific and fighting the Japanese as it went. With the destruction of the battle fleet, this paradigm disappeared and the Navy had to attempt to reconfigure. It had spent a lot of time preparing for operating aircraft carriers, though, so this wasn't too difficult a paradigm shift to initially undertake. And in the early months of 1942, a series of successful carrier raids prevented the Japanese from achieving all of their objectives. And these eventually culminated in the Battle of Coral Sea in May 1942, where the Japanese attempt to seize Port Moresby was thwarted, and then the Battle of Midway in June, where the Japanese carrier fleet was severely damaged and forced to retreat. This gave Admiral Nimitz, the new commander of the Pacific Fleet, an opportunity to seize the offensive and to take the island of Guadalcanal, seen here in the background over the shoulder of this transport ship. And this was something different, because the Navy had assumed that it would be able to advance fairly rapidly in pre-war models, trials, and exercises. The Navy recognized that one of the most vulnerable states it could find itself in was defending a fixed position. Mobility of the fleet was very important. The campaign for Guadalcanal lasted 6 months. Mobility was not something the fleet was able to achieve. And it provided the first opportunity for the two fleets to engage in surface combat. First real opportunity. And a lot of the exercises on both sides for this kind of fighting had been performed in daylight. Both navies were very adequately prepared for this. And you can see here, this is a picture of 3 American cruisers. The little dots off to the right are float planes that are going to be picked up by the cruisers in a moment. So both navies, particularly the US Navy, had invested a great deal of time and effort in figuring out how to create a multifaceted, multidimensional combat force that could use airplanes and surface ships together to fight battles and win. But because there was an airfield on Guadalcanal that the Americans seized, they controlled the skies around the island. This meant that the Japanese, if they wanted to come into the waters around the island, would not come in daylight. They would come at night. And at night, things are a lot more confusing, a lot more difficult. This is a picture from one of the battles fought off of the island. And you can contrast it very much with this, where it's easy to make sense of it. Hey, there's 3 ships there. We can see them. We can see where they are. There's 3 ships here, too. It might not be quite as obvious, but that's the case. And in these night battles, there were 5 of them fought around Guadalcanal, it became very difficult for commanders and captains to understand what was going on. You can get a sense of that from the picture. It's hard to tell what exactly is happening. I mean, it's a ship, it's shooting. What kind of ship is it? Whose ship is it? And after it fires, this flash will disappear. And those of us who are looking at it will be momentarily blinded because the flash is so brilliant. So it's very difficult to make sense of things. It's very difficult to understand what is going on. And so one of the recurring themes through these fights was how hard it was to understand what exactly was happening. And that difficulty was exacerbated by the fact that the United States Navy had not prepared for a war on 2 fronts. We need to remember Germany declared war the day after Pearl Harbor. There was a war going on in the Atlantic as well. This stretched the US Navy beyond its prepared limits. Some of you who know something about history might say, well, what about radar? Radar had been invented. The United States Navy ships had radar, right? And there's 6 different radars in this picture. On the left is Battleship Washington. There's 4 different radars on her main mast, and then there are 2 here on the cruiser Chester. But these radars are very early and they're relatively unsophisticated. The majority of them have a display like this. It's called the A-scope. And it's a nice two-dimensional display that looks a lot like a conventional oscilloscope. And as the radar turns, we get a sense of whether or not there might be any contacts on the bearing that it is facing. This is not the conventional radar picture that all of us are used to seeing. This is a very linear picture. So as the radar moves around, the operator would periodically, if he finds a contact, say, well, there's a contact and it's at this bearing and it's at this range. And that information would make its way to the captain, and the captain would have to keep track of these various contact reports that he was receiving in his head, and combine that with what he could see with all the flashing gunfire around him, and try to understand how these ships were all fitting together, and which ones were friendly and which ones weren't. Now, at the Naval Research Laboratory, just before the war, they had invented this. This is the Plan Position Indicator display, which is the radar that most of us are familiar with. You get a top-down view of the world surrounding the ship. This makes it a lot easier for someone looking at the radar to understand what is going on, or at least we would think so. But again, the information being relayed to the captain is the same. There is a contact at such and such a range on such and such a bearing. Very difficult to translate that into something actionable when you're trying to process all this information in your head. And it's complicated by the fact that this is what some of the PPI displays look like. These are actual photographs. It's very difficult to make sense of this. The largest pieces here are islands, and some of the smallest bits are actual ships. But it's a little hard to tell which is which or make sense of it all. Right? So some of you may be thinking right now, what does this have to do? What does this have to do with Kanban? Well, it's a problem that's not dissimilar from some of the things that our teams face. The work that we do can be difficult to keep track of. A lot of it might live in people's heads, right? So we can lose track of that just as the captains lost track of the situation in these fights, all right? And our ability to collaborate and coordinate can become very difficult if we lose that sense. But an important thing to keep in mind, and what the Navy was able to discover, is that the relevant information to allow this coordinated action and behavior is there. It's present, but we're not acting on it. So the solution that the Navy came to was to create something called a Combat Information Center, where all the sources of information would come, be collected, be collated, and then be visualized so that someone could interpret it and provide actionable information. And that began to be presented like this, right? So this is a plot, this is an example plot of the kind of environment that a ship might face, right? So on the upper half, we have an aerial contact. On the lower half, there are surface contacts. And now, if you get this kind of information, if you're looking over the shoulder of the operators generating this as a captain, it becomes very clear what is going on. You get situational awareness. You get a sense of what is happening because this is being visualized in front of you. You don't have to translate, well, there's a contact at such and such a bearing at such and such a range into some sense of the world around you. You can see the world around you. And this was done by creating new roles, and it distributes the cognitive load, right? So whereas before the captains are trying to process all this information in their heads, now a distributed team, distributed in terms of, individuals networked together in the same location, is creating the information. And then someone else is acting on it, right? So you have radar operators who are doing their standard reporting, but then you have plotters who are plotting this information, and someone who's standing back and looking at it, making sense of it, to the captain so he can take action. And from this, they developed an ability to rapidly understand what was going on and take action on it. I believe we can do the same sort of thing, follow the same basic model with Kanban. So, what I'm getting at with distributed cognition here is the idea that we can create systems that have a cognitive capacity or capability that exceeds that of any of the individuals in the system, or potentially just the sum of the individuals within the system, right? Through their interactions, through visualizations and rules, we get a cognitive capacity that is not present in the parts that make up the system. Let me give you another example. So this is an idea that was developed by John Searle. It's kind of a thought experiment. He calls it the Chinese room. Now, John cannot speak Chinese, but he hypothesizes that if he gets in a rule book that allows him to provide coherent responses to Chinese inputs and then feed them back to people, he can create a system that makes it appear as if he understands Chinese, right? So he gets in a room, he gets inputs, people come to the room, write something in Chinese, slide it under the door. On the other side of the door, he's got his sort of rule listing, looks at the input, looks up a valid output for that input, writes it down, copies it, slides it back through the door. And so people interfacing with this room, with John through the room, through the door, think that the room, or someone in the room, understands Chinese. But he doesn't. He just has a series of rules, a series of canned responses. Now, John's field is AI, but I think this is a very nice example of how you can create a distributed cognitive system, because between John, who's acting as the agent to write things down and understand what's coming in, and the rule book that's been created for him, you've got an understanding of Chinese. You've got a cognitive Chinese system. But he doesn't understand Chinese. And he doesn't have to. So, one of the things that I think it's very important to keep in mind when we think about software systems is that it's a human system, right? It's a cultural system. We are collaborating. We are working together. And until we begin to make some of our expectations of how to interact or what we're working on explicit, they remain implicit. And when they're implicit, we take different assumptions about them. If we make them explicit, we can produce rules, patterns of behavior, or symbols, representations of information, and then we can offload some of the cognitive burden that we have when we are either going about our work or interacting with each other, whether it's thinking about the room, or it's thinking about the CIC, or it's thinking about a Kanban system. Right? Because what we see in this example plot, the information that leads into it is a series of rules. What's on there are a series of symbols, and it presents a new level of cognitive capability through that mechanism. There are rules behind it as well in terms of how the information gets there, not only in terms of how we write it down. And we can get a lot of benefits from this, right? So one of the things that we can get is it makes it a lot easier for us to understand the current situation, right? In the CIC, it's visualized. It's up there on the plot. We can see what is happening. We can see what is going on. We don't have to keep the information in our head, and the information that is out there now becomes shared. So it's not my sense of what's going on, and it's not John's sense of what's going on. It's a shared sense of what's going on. Because we're not having to juggle an understanding of what is happening, our individual cognitive burden is lowered, right? The system takes over some of what we had been devoting our cognitive capacity to. This makes it easier to self-organize because we have this shared sense of the current state. And it allows us to align our decision-making more effectively if we have a shared sense of where we are and what we're being confronted with. Kanban can do all these things. So what are some ways to do that? So with Kanban, this is one of my definitions. It's a relatively simple definition, but I think it's a pretty good one. I believe it is a visual approach to work, and it emphasizes flow, collaboration, and continual improvement. Part of the problem with this definition is that we might end up with something just like this. All right, this is a nice visualization. There's a lot of Kanban systems that are like this out there. And we can see how the work flows along. And this is great. Work moves through the system. We gain a shared understanding of where these things are and what we might want to do about them. But if we backtrack for a second, this gets us on the path. But this is not a true Kanban system, I would argue. And it doesn't get us to where distributed cognition could. So let's look at a more sophisticated definition, right? And here we've introduced the idea of the method, the Kanban method, as coined by David Anderson. And he says it's got these three elements. It directly improves service delivery. Now, what comes along with that is you orient your Kanban system towards a specific service, to do a thing, to accomplish something. And it can catalyze improvements, and it can make that service delivery more fit for purpose, more effective at satisfying whatever that end goal might be. There are 6 practices that come along with this. Visualization, which we already looked at, limiting WIP, or reducing the amount of work in progress, which is key. You might argue that that is a subset of the 4th one, making policies explicit, because a WIP limit is a policy, and usually WIP limits are visualized, and that's a way to make a policy explicit. Those are the 3 that I think are most important for creating a system that enables distributed cognition, right? So that gets us a visualization. So through the visualization, we derive a shared sense of what is happening. And the other 2, we create rules and symbols that allow us to offload some of our cognitive burden. And I believe it is that capability which makes it easier to accomplish the other 3, the management of flow, the implementation of feedback loops, and continually improving what we have. That is, if you offload some of that cognitive burden, you'll have more resources available to do those other things. So let's get a little more specific of how to tie the 2 together. I think we could use Kanban to make sense of complex and challenging knowledge work, or to be very specific about one of the things that we hope to achieve, right? You want to be able to use the system and understand what to do next. Help make effective decisions. So, a more personal anecdote. My wife likes to host a Seder every year. And it's her family tradition. So, when we started, I didn't know a lot about it. But I wanted to help. However, the first couple times we got into it, it became much easier for her to just do the things rather than explaining to me what I could do next, right? Because explaining to me what was necessary to do next was going to take more time than it was for her to just decide what to do and do it herself. It was very difficult for me to help. She's got a lot of energy, she's motivated, she's clear about what she wants. All great characteristics, not always great when you want to cooperate in the kitchen. So, prior to doing this a couple years ago, I sat down and I said, how about we write down all the things that we need to do? how about we try to develop an understanding what all those things are so that I'm not trying to draw it out of your head in the middle of it. It's just like, oh, that sounds like a good idea. Yeah, we can try that. Cool. So we did that. That's what all these Post-its are. And then just set up a very simple sort of to-do, doing, done. So not a very elaborate or sophisticated Kanban, but a nice symbol of where are we with things. And you can see there's an awful lot when I took this picture in our to-do, because we just used the 3 cabinet fronts there as the columns. And here's the close-up on one of the tickets, probably the most important ticket, because it's the brisket. Right? Now, this is the kind of information we put on there, right? So what is it? How long is it going to take to do the thing? When do we want the thing to be done? And so when do we have to start it? Just quick little backdating there. But we started with the first 2, like the duration and the completion time, and realized pretty quickly that doing that mental math in the midst of it was going to be kind of difficult. So we did the math beforehand and wrote it on there. And then a few more details, like for this one specifically, hey, the oven should be set at 350. Great. This was wonderful because when I got a thing done, I didn't have to bug her and ask her, hey, what should I do next? What's the next most important thing to do? Get it done, and I'd look up. And based on the timings and where we were with everything, I knew what to do next. And I knew what was involved. And so we bang, bang, bang through all the stuff. And was there talking? Sure. But what were we talking about? We were talking about feedback on how I'd done a thing. Or, there's nothing that I need to be starting right now. Could I be washing that? Right? The conversation was focused around other stuff rather than trying to understand the work, because we'd already understood the work and we put the work up on the cabinet. Worked really well. It was a rudimentary system of distributed cognition, but we can get better than that. One of the things that we want to do with a Kanban system is we want to make a pull system. We want to be able to create signals when there's capacity for new work and allow those signals to bubble back upstream so that we can pull work across. Right? And we can do this with the WIP limits. And they provide us nice signals of what actions to take and when to take it, much like I had when we were preparing the Seder. All right, so now this is a Kanban board. This is a nice Kanban board because it's got WIP limits up there, right? It's got some work in the system. And the other thing that we've got are some policies down at the bottom that are very explicit about what criteria are necessary to move from one category of the workflow to another. And we know what they are. So that creates a shared sense. So we don't have to know, well, did the unit testing happen between validate and done? Well, we don't have to ask ourselves that question because that's one of the policies for moving from validate to done, say. And you see these dashed lines on here, the dashed boxes. Those are the pull signals. Those are the virtual Kanban. Right? Kanban is a signaling system. And when we create a board like this, Kanban has 2 meanings relative to it. One is the board itself, the visualization. And the other is the signaling method. And in that aspect, this is a virtual Kanban because the signaling method is virtual. We do the math in our heads. We look at the fact that the WIP limit on validate is 3. But there's only 2 items in there. So that's why we have the 1 dashed box underneath it, because that is a virtual signal that allows us to pull more work into that. Right? And as that happens, these pull signals travel back upstream. Right? So we pulled something from analysis into development. Now we have the signal that we can pull more work into analysis and work flows across. Right? So we are able to restrict the flow of work and know when and how we should start more or pull more into the next stage. So we're getting there. We're embedding more knowledge in the system and getting to the point where we're offloading more of our cognitive burden. But we can make it better. classes of service is a very effective way to add more intelligence to the system. And these are specific policies around how we're going to handle work. Right? Sometimes this gets equated with types of work. It's not types of work. You might have different types of work, right? You're going to have spikes. You're going to have stories. You're going to have tasks or maybe a few other things. But you want to be able to handle work differently based on different criteria, right? How urgent is it? How much risk is there associated with it? What kind of, who did it come from? When is it due? Right? You might want to treat these things differently. And so you can create classes of service for this. There are 4 typical ones. You can create others depending upon the nature of your system. But these are the most common ones that get referenced. And in a sense, they have some like increasing level of importance as you go up the slide. And the expedite, that's pretty obvious. It's something we got to do right away. Typically, you get some cost of delay estimates or elements associated with these different classes. That would be the one with the highest cost of delay. Fixed date, as the name implies, is due at a specific time. If you get it done by that time, woohoo, great. If you don't get it done by that time, there is some consequence, right? So there's some risk associated with that that is greater than the standard ticket, which is one that's just going to be handled like pretty much every other ticket. And then there's the intangible class of service, which is a thing that we ought to spend some time on, but if we don't get it done anytime soon, it's not a big deal. And you can see how a specific piece of work or type of work might flow between these as time changes, right? So upgrading your Oracle database today might be an intangible class of work because you know you need to do it eventually, but the current version is going to be supported for the foreseeable future, so no big deal. But if the version that you're on isn't going to be supported past next month, then that becomes either a fixed date or perhaps even an expedite task, right? So the relationship between the work that you have to do and the time has some bearing on the class of service. If we think about the SATR tickets, we were able to make some decisions about classes of service or when to take on specific work because we knew what time it was and we knew what time something had to be started. So they were all fixed time in a sense. So you could say that they were all the same class of service, but because the environment was very dynamic, we could make decisions about what to do and when to do it based on how closely we were approaching the specific start time if we hadn't done it yet. So you can get dynamic with some of these things as well. And this is how it might look if you make a Kanban system and have classes of service on it, right? So here we have a similar board to the one before, but now we have classes of service in it. And we've got that expedite ticket on there, so we're going to work hard to move that one across, right? And that seems an obvious decision when we look at it, right? Whereas before, they were all the same type of work. Now we've got different classes of service, and we're treating the expedite ticket differently. We're rushing it across to get it over and to validate. And we'll move that over here too. Oh, and I should explain, typically expedite tickets do not count against the WIP limits. That's why we've got 4 items packed there in validate, right? So we're able to bend the rules a little bit because this expedite is a hot thing that we need to get done. So we're going to, with some knowledge, violate the WIP limit in order to accomplish that. And then we're going to start pulling over some of these fixed date tickets because they have a due date, and that's important, and maybe the due date is near. And so we're going to work on that stuff. All right. Now, we can get even more sophisticated than this. I mean, that's about as far as most systems will take it. And that's good, right? We were able to make some intelligent decisions, or I'm sure you could imagine some intelligent decisions behind the scenes as those tickets were moving across. But we can combine classes of service with capacity allocations to introduce another layer of policies that makes it even easier to make decisions. And these are specific policies about how much capacity in our system or how much work of a certain class we are going to have in the system at a given time. And if you introduce this, then you've got a mechanism for creating a decision framework that makes it very easy for people who are interacting with the system or operating with the system to make decisions in light of the rules and policies that have been established. So let's see this in action. All right, so now we've explicitly said that the expedite is 1. We can only have 1 on the board at a given time, and the +1 means that it does not count towards the WIP limits. We want 4 fixed state tickets in our system at a given time, 8 standard and 3 intangible. All right, so let's just say the first thing that we do, that standard one is done, so we'll pull it over, we'll validate it. Now we're definitely going to move on the expedite ticket and get that into development. Bring the fixed date ticket over too, it's done. Finish that intangible, move another fixed date over, move that one over into development. We'll bring these 2 in because they're ready. Now, we got 4 slots in ready. And we've got those 6 options for us to work on. 3 standard, 2 fixed date, and an intangible. With the rules that we've established, what should we pull into our system?
2 fixed state, standard, and then
All right, one at a time. I believe you spoke first here, Quentin.
so 2 fixed state, standard, and then intangible.
2 fixed state, a standard, and an intangible. Okay, so what brings you to that?
Well, with the fixed date, you have 4 max that you can use at any one time. So getting those out, depending on the fixed date that they require, having them at least getting to ready will move them along. The intangible, I would say, because you don't necessarily know when, so it's at least good to get that in ready and going forward. And then standard, you kind of already have an idea of how long that should take to get through the entire process. So just to at least get one of those going to knock out the other 2 in succession.
Okay, does anybody have a different opinion? Yes?
Don't put any in.
Don't put any in. And what brings you to that?
Because if you introduce things in the front end, already you're in a block status. Because assuming that there's a finite amount of time, you could just assign the same number to the duration in those queues. You're not going to be able to clear your queue fast enough.
So just to be specific, which block state are you thinking about?
Well, I'm saying you're going to have multiple blocks because you're already blocked. It's validating stage.
Oh, okay.
Because it's going to take a finite amount of time to clear that queue.
I thought.
Then you have more coming in than you can clear out of the queue. So everything behind that point will just back up. Pro rata.
Okay.
So you have
I thought.
some slack in your system to clear the queues.
Ah, right. Well, the way, ideally, we'll have slack at these WIP limits. And if we don't, then we have a problem. But you're suggesting we should have slack even beyond the WIP limits,
Well, you have to
right?
define slack. I mean, if it's a network, like a router,
Mhm.
you just stop. You won't get anything through.
Oh, sure. But I'm assuming in this sense that we would still be working at an acceptable pace even at these WIP limits.
Okay, then how do you deal with going from development to validate, where you have more in process than you can clear from queue? You only have 3 slots in validate.
Right.
So assuming that you have some, standard duration of 5 items, right? 3 are going to move in. You're going to have 2 backed up that you can't clear. Because when you move in the replacement items, you're going to be at 100% capacity.
I'm not sure I'm following you.
Somebody else?
So even if the capacity is 3, you could bring in the expedited, it's a special case. So that can be brought.
Well, how do you do that?
So
I'm just talking math now. So,
but I think there's two variables. One is it's a pull system. So you're pulling things through, you're not waiting for inertia to just push it through. And I think the other thing you said is 100% capacity. 100% whip limit isn't necessarily 100% capacity.
Yes.
So I think that is a larger, or an assumption that should be erased. To say, if we're at our whip limit, we're still sane. If we're at 100% capacity, we are not sane.
Yeah, and there, what I'm saying is that if you assign some finite number to those 5 items, let's say in points, you just took whatever the number is to the right, you'll have that many points that you have to clear out of the system. So unless you have that much capacity in your pipe all the way through, it'll block.
Well, let's assume, for the sake of argument, that these whip limits promote a healthy flow with the system.
Yeah.
So happy to talk to you a little bit more afterward about what your concerns are, but I'd like to hear from someone else what they think would be the logical thing to pull in. Because I think we've heard, you said 2 fixed date, 1 standard, and 1 intangible?
Yes.
Right? Okay. Does anybody else have a different suggestion?
1 fixed date, 3 standard,
Okay. What brings you to that?
because you can have 4 fixed date, you've already got 3 on the board, so you pull 1 in.
Okay.
And by definition, it's 8 standard, you've got 5 active,
Right.
so you bring 3 more in.
Okay. Yeah. Now,
Oh, I mean, I like his logic too.
yes, I like Quentin's logic too. Right. Anybody got another option?
So the fixed date ones,
Mhm.
if you have the dates, if you know the dates ahead, then you could plan it very well, which one to pull in. If some of the fixed date may be later.
Right. Yeah. I really like where you guys are going with this. So, Quentin, you're not wrong, right? I understand your logic perfectly, right? Because you're saying, okay, we have 3 fixed dates already in the system. We have a capacity allocation of 4 fixed dates, so we should only pull the 1, right? That's the decision rule that we have set up. Exactly. Your point was, hey, the fixed date, they're going to be due. Maybe we should start on them. But you see, now we're having a conversation about the specifics of those dates and whether or not it makes sense to pull them in, right? We're not blindly pulling work. These criteria that we've established, these rules, are helping us have a healthy conversation around what work to do and the specific characteristics of that work and whether or not to bring it in at this time now that we have that capacity, right? And we're able to do that because of the framework we've established here with the whip limits and with the different capacity allocations. So I could hear also 1 fixed date, 2 standard, and 1 intangible, because we want to have 3 intangible, and there's only 2 intangible up there. Yeah.
So the point is to nail down your policies so that they're much more explicit. Well, no, I don't mean to be funny about it. It seems that everyone had valid input.
Yeah, right.
But the valid input, the reason why Quentin and Paul and everyone had differing perceptions is because the policies were nebulous. So I'm looking at that and I see fixed date 4. I don't know, and this is, me being inexperienced, and I apologize, but I don't know what that means horizontally.
Mm-hmm.
So can I have only, those 3 that are in validate, development, analysis, and maybe 1 in ready? Or does that mean, or is it vertical?
It-
I only have,
Yeah. It is intended to mean across the system, so between ready and validate.
sure.
So we leave off done, right,
But my
yeah.
point being that,
Mhm.
that the Kanban principle of explicitly stated policies is where we're tripping up right.
Well, what I'm hoping to illustrate is that they should be explicit enough to facilitate an effective conversation around what to do, right? So we need to know enough about this work, about why we've chosen 4 fixed date. Like maybe in our organization. Yeah, sure.
If I'm having a conversation to hash out what the consensus understanding is of the policy, I would argue that the policies fail. I would argue that I should be able to know with a certain degree of confidence
Mm-hmm.
that because policy is X, I do Y.
Mm-hmm.
And I shouldn't have to have the conversation about that as you pointed out in your Seder example earlier, what I really want to have the conversation about is not what to do next, but how to optimize what I'm doing for the next time around.
Yes, I agree with you. I was trying to illustrate that in this quick example, we have very little context, right? So we do not know the information behind why fixed date, for example, is 4, because that's going to be one of the key aspects of the decision. I think that it's still valuable to have the conversation as long as it's informed conversation. So the policy helps inform the conversation. The policy is not going to be contingent or allow us to understand all the potential circumstances that are going to arise. But the policy needs to allow us to focus in on so that the most of the time we make the decision without having to really think. Like, this is what we should do. And it's the exceptional circumstances where we have the conversation. What I was hoping to illustrate with this example, with the multiple potential right answers, is that it can quickly get us to a subset of what we should do, and then from there, we can have a conversation about the extremities, right? So we're debating whether, 1 or 2 fixed date. We're not debating whether or not all of it should be fixed date right now. Are there other questions about this? Cool. All right. So I think this is what, maybe not to this quite extreme, but this idea of having the explicit policies, or explicit enough policies, let's say, using not just the WIP limits, but capacity allocations and classes of service, is what we should be trying to aspire to with our Kanban systems, because that allows us to offload a large degree of the cognitive burden of keeping track of our work and understanding what to do next. And that gives us more opportunity to talk about how we might make the policies better and enhance them and improve the flow of work through the system to understand better, to John's point, are we blocked through here, or is it flowing nicely? Which is another piece of context that we're missing with this example. So to summarize, I think this concept of distributed cognition is a real thing. I think it's important. I think it's valuable. I think we need to think about how we bring it into our work, because it allows us to make better decisions, it makes us more aligned, and it allows more effective self-organization and delegation, which are key aspects of what we're trying to achieve in Agile. And key elements of it are having an effective visualization and policies that go along with that visualization that tie it together and create this shared sense of what's going on and offloads some of what is typically in our heads. So this was, for me, very pleasant and a nice example of some of the things that I care a great deal about. If you are interested in these Kanban ideas, we will delve into them in a lot more detail at the KMP1, the Kanban System Design class that we're going to host in April. And so if you'd like to come to that, learn a little bit more, please sign up. It's on our website. And if you know anybody else who would like to attend, please recommend it. And if you've got any questions in the meantime, please come up and talk to me or ask them now as a group. Yes?
Well, those little tickets that you had on your board there, is there an assumption about relative size? Are they pretty close to being in the same amount of effort to make this effective?
It depends a little bit on who you talk to. The way I like to approach it is you don't want these to be too big, right?
Too what?
Too big.
Yeah, okay.
They do not all have to be similarly sized. There's going to be a lot of variability, even if you try to get them to the same size, right? So a lot of teams will do pointing exercises. Scrum teams typically do that. And if you look at the variability of, say, their 5-point stories, they're going to vary a good bit. Sometimes they're going to be off, and they're going to have 5-point stories that are going to blow up to like 13 points or go beyond the length of a sprint. So the key thing for this kind of a system is to make sure that it's not too big, right? Make sure it's not, build the space shuttle. That's too big. And what too big is going to vary depending on context. the rule of thumb that I like to use is, do we think we can get it done in a week? If we think we can move it across the board in a week, then we should probably let it into our system. If we think it's going to take more than a week, let's break it down. Now, that may mean some things are smaller than a week. Some things might be like 2 days. That's okay. Don't add more stuff to it to make it a week size. Right? Other questions? Yes?
I mean, I'm sure everyone has their own sort of toolbox for this, but any recommended tools as far as like, just whether it's software, whether it's, I mean, Post-it notes are totally cool, but like, any recommended tools that allow you to set up and kind of police this?
I think
just like Trello.
I think Post-it notes are totally cool. I think Trello is really weak in terms of this. Linkit is a very nice tool. I like that. It's relatively lightweight, but it gives you a lot of functionality and can give you a lot of information and reports that come out of it. I think Jira is also relatively weak. I've tried to use Jira for this, and it's kind of difficult. There's another tool that I haven't played around with in a professional sense called Kanban Flow. I use that personally, though, and so as an individual, that works pretty well. I'm not sure how well it would work for a team. And there is a third one that David Anderson and his folks are advocating, but the name of that escapes me at the moment.
You said Lean Kit was the first one?
Yeah, Linkit. Yeah. I think you had a question too. Yes, 2 questions. Oh boy.
Question. Is the Kanban Seder for the wise son, the simple son, the wicked son, or the son who does not ask the question?
That one went over my head, so I'm not sure.
So here's the second question.
I appreciate that, but I'm not going to be able to respond to you in kind.
What are some effective feedback loops in a good, well-operated Kanban system?
The board itself is the primary feedback loop, right? We want to be standing up in front of the board every day, doing something like the equivalent of a stand-up, but more of the boardwalk. So rather than the 3 questions that are typical in Scrum about what an individual did or did not do over the last day, we want to look at the work on the board, walk it from right to left, and try to figure out how to move it to done. So that's a very effective feedback mechanism. What John pointed out, I think, is very good, and it's nice for this, right? So he's saying we're already at capacity. We shouldn't bring any more work in. Hard to argue with that, right? So the board itself becomes as the WIP limits get hit, that might be a signal that we've got too much work in the system, right? A lot of that can be a leading indicator of a potential problem. So like right now, I would be asking questions about what's going on with the analysis work. And are there enough people devoted to that? Because we've got 3 things in progress, which is at our WIP limit. It would be nice to see one of those things in done or 2 of those things in done. Why are they not there? So that's a nice feedback loop. But there should be periodic retrospectives as we do in Scrum. Sometimes those are triggered by an expedite ticket is a great reason to have a retrospective. There's an expedite ticket on this board. We should get it done. It's very important to get it done. Get it done. Once it's over, why did we have to have an expedite ticket, right? Expedite shouldn't be normal. Normal should be work flowing through the system at a relatively predictable rate, at a sustainable pace. Expedite should be some kind of bizarre emergency or disruption. So why did that happen? Another really good feedback loop. I didn't talk about this, but it's worth keeping in mind. Different work is going to have defects, right? So we'll go through analysis to development, and maybe in development we'll realize, oh my goodness, the acceptance criteria is totally wrong. The plan we have for this is all messed up. We're going to have to, rework it or do something. More typically that happens once it gets to validate, right? And we're testing it and we find a bug. But those kinds of incidents can be tacked up on the board. They become a Post-it note. Periodically grab all of those. I mean, you'll address it, right? You'll take that Post-it note off, but stick it somewhere. Keep it. every couple weeks, gather those and make that the basis for a retrospective. Why did those happen? What introduced them? So just some quick ones. Yes?
So is this tool meant more for like a project manager, or is this meant for like the entire team? And I guess the follow-on question is, in the actual post-its that you had, it didn't address like who was tasked for this, or how does that kind of play into this?
Good questions, good questions. So is it for the team or the project manager? And names weren't on the post-it notes that I had. This is for the team. That should be the primary objective. It should help the team organize and understand their work and figure out how to self-organize around it to get it done. It's a great tool for potentially a manager or other people outside the team, because they can periodically walk by and see what the team is working on. They can understand what's happening. So in a way, it becomes a status reporting mechanism without having a deliberate status report, right? You want to know what the team's working on? Go look at that board. Oh, hey, that's what the team's working on. Oh, and I see you have a bug on this one. How's that going? Right?
So the team is the actual ones moving.
Yes. Yes, absolutely. The team is moving it all. Either when they get together in the morning or throughout the day. Ideally, throughout the day, so that anytime anybody looks at the board, they know the current state.
So the team itself addresses who takes and does what?
Yes, 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 they should. Yeah, so, if you pull something into analysis, you are signing up for that work. I mean, ideally, maybe you're not there that day and somebody else is pulling it over because you've chosen to work on it. But if the manager is taking something and sticking it into one of those columns and writing somebody's name on it, then people are not self-assigning to work, and you don't really have a pull system anymore. It may be operating as a pull system, but if you're writing my name on a piece of work and signing me up for it, I'm not pulling. You're pushing to me. I won't be as inspired to work on it in that situation. Nothing against you, it's just how that works.
So then at the end, in the done column, then someone writes their name to take credit for it then, right?
If they want to, I mean, one of the things that I've seen it pretty clever on a physical board, especially if it's magnetic, you might have an avatar, and when you're working on a ticket, you stick your avatar on that ticket. And the nice thing about that is you can take it back off again. So you might work on the thing, suppose you're a developer and that's your specialty, you might work on the things that are in development, but you're not doing a lot of the analysis or the validate. So the fact that your name is only on there for a brief period of time indicates that's when you were working on it. Other groups will write names on there. That might be a little trickier, because then, what if you are the analyst and you wrote your name on it, but now you're not doing anything with it, but people see your name on there and they're going to come to you with questions about it and you don't know. So, lots of questions. Let's start with Claire.
What's a good rule of thumb for determining with limits, especially at the beginning of a project, and then how do you know if they're too low versus you have a lot of team members now?
Oh, that's a cool question. So how do you start off with WIP limits, and how do you know if they're too big or too low? The easy and kind of lazy answer to how to start with WIP limits is just pick the number of people that might be doing that function. I hate that answer, but it's quick and it solves some arguments. But I would talk about it as a group. Like, what do we feel like makes sense? But then, very quickly, measure how long it takes work to get through the system. So measure the lead time, the time from when you pull something into ready to when it gets to done. And because the WIP limits are going to be the best lever to control that rate. And if that rate is too long, lower the WIP limits. So the key there is figuring out what are the expectations that are on the team. How fast are they expected to be able to deliver work? And some of that will be on the team itself, but it's important to understand the stakeholders that are receiving work from the team are expecting that work. And if that turnaround time isn't fast enough, then that becomes a feedback loop into how do we make it faster. And the WIP limits are a good lever to do that. Wow.
So
similar, sort of building off the question from the other side of the room, you know, I mean, it's like, not all, like, Scrum teams will be made up of, like, a number of different skill sets.
Yes.
So, how would you approach a situation, say, within analysis, or within development specifically, where maybe only one or two members of a Scrum team actually have the expertise, even say that it could be 8 developers, but it's only 2 of those developers have the expertise to accomplish a specific task. Like,
Okay.
you know, because like to me, it would almost seem like it's like almost another class of service, because it's going to lock. Not exactly. It's like it's the best way to maybe shoehorn it into the metaphor.
Yeah, maybe.
It's another thing where it's like like a ticket could completely block a resource for the time that they're doing on it, but you can't put it anywhere else because otherwise it's not going to get done. So I'm just it's a tough one. I don't know. I'm just.
Yeah, those are tough questions. One of the first things that I would seek to do with that is have some sort of other visualization that would allow us to see what kind of skill sets we have relative to the work that we have. So if there are only, say, 2 developers within an 8-person team that can do a certain type of work, if we all know that, do we think that's acceptable?
Yeah.
And maybe it isn't. And if it isn't, then how do we solve that? And I would approach that by, or at least with the mechanisms that we've talked about so far tonight, I would consider setting up some sort of capacity allocation around that.
Yeah.
Right? So don't treat it as a different class of service, but recognize that when that kind of work comes in, there's very few specialties that can work on it.
Yeah.
And so don't let a whole lot of that work come in at once.
Yeah.
And to try, because what you want to try to do is smooth out the flow. So that's going to block one of those 2 people when it comes in, maybe both if they're pairing.
Yeah.
So don't let a lot of that work come in simultaneously, otherwise it's going to cause a blockage.
Yeah, it's like you can almost have like a separate Kanban board for that type of work exclusively, and just make sure that your WIP limits.
That I wouldn't do.
It's like I agree. It's like all the knee-jerk solutions that I'm coming up with, I don't like them either. But then like.
Well, the big reason why I wouldn't have a separate board is because let's say I've got that expertise, and if it's all on the same board, suppose you want to learn about it. And I pull that work over and I start working on it and we talk about it in the morning and blah, blah, blah. Then you have an option because you're looking at the same board that I'm looking at and you can say, hey, I want to learn that. Can I pair with you today?
Yeah.
And that opportunity is lost if we're looking at different boards, even if we're on the same team. Also, different boards, but one team, it becomes very difficult to maintain WIP limits effectively.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Every time I've seen that, it's gone downhill fast.
Gotcha. Yeah, no, I asked just because it's like, it's not names. Names matter in some cases much less than like actual like
Skill sets.
And what's actionable for a given person.
Yeah. Jeff, I think you had a question.
I was going to observe that for many ops teams like the continuous flow model of Kanban.
Yes.
And I was going to respond to the question from the other side of the room that if you aspire to have a self-managing team, I aspire to have a self-managing team. I would rather have team members moving their items than having a person in charge of moving all the items. Because the way that these systems usually work best, at least for our teams, is if they're heavily invested in it and they live in the system, as opposed to the system belongs to some third-party priestess. That person does all of the changes.
The lady in the pond distributing the swords.
Taking away a job.
It's just cognition.
And that gets into all the self-improvement elements of it, Jeff. So I'm glad you bring that up. If the team doesn't feel like they own this, their relationship with how to make it better is going to be fundamentally different. And Matthias, or are you telling us that we need to wrap it up?
No, I think we have a little bit of time, not a whole lot. I wanted to piggyback real quick on that question about the feedback loops. I think you still have the feedback loop of simply getting a task item to done so that whoever it's for can then react to it and tell you whether it's right and whether it's good for them and all of that, which I guess is the focus on working things to completion. But that actually brought something up in your animation as these different classes of service moved through, I noticed that they were not always coming from the top of the list.
No.
Does that mean that you're changing priorities within a given column, and what does that mean for the items, for the service classes with the lowest priorities? One of the intangibles being sort of the stepchild of the Kanban board be stuck in its column forever. Well, I mean, if there's always
It could.
fixed dates coming through.
It could, but then we'll know that it's been on there a long time, and that will influence our behavior. So maybe we are consciously choosing to leave it there. Maybe if it stayed there long enough, we should abandon it and not get it done. But yeah, I wasn't moving things always off the top. I know one of the things that some teams will do is they will reshuffle the columns and make sure that the most important thing is at the top. I think that's a pretty good rule of thumb, but I don't think you necessarily have to adhere to that because you may decide in the moment that, oh, this piece of work that's not on the top is more important, or maybe you don't want to go through all the work of reshuffling them. So that was one of the reasons I didn't do that in the animation.
Just in case it's useful, some job schedulers will actually increment the priority of a job as it is in wait state.
So the longer it sits in waiting, the more important it becomes.
Yes, to help make sure that some jobs eventually get processing time, get time to be worked on. Because the thing, importance, what's most important in a column is often judged as what's most urgent. And of course we all know that that's not exactly true, but we also know that that tends to happen. So there's something to be said for as stuff ages, consider whether to either trash it or bump it up.
Yeah, and I think having if you put the dates on these, like when they came into ready, that becomes a mechanism for doing that, because we can all see when we sort of committed to working on it, not necessarily finishing, but committing to pulling it in. And as that ages, that then becomes well, what are we going to do about it? Oh, back to the question on tools. I remember the other tool. It's sort of more enterprise-like, but it's called Swift Kanban. You might look into that as well.
All right, one more question if there are any. No? All right. Awesome.
Cool.
Well then, thank you.
Yeah, thank you.